Good evening. My name is Johanna Koljonen and you are watching Crosstalks, a collaboration between two of Sweden's leading universities, Stockholm University and KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. Please do take advantage of the unique opportunity to ask questions of our participating experts at the end of the show. You do so by simply calling us on Skype, where our name is Crosstalks TV. And as always, you can discuss today's topics on Twitter, where we call ourselves Crosstalks TV. And our hashtag is Crosstalks. The number of wild animals on Earth has halved in the past 40 years, according to a recent report released by the World Wildlife Fund. Many species of animals and plants are on the verge of extinction. But what does this imply for life on Earth? Can we save these species? Should we save them all? Today, in theory, we also have the capacity to bring back to life some species that have died out. But is this playing God? And what could be some of the consequences if we did? Joining us today in the studio are Jens Lagergren, Professor in Computer Science and Computational Biology at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. Bodil Elmhagen, Associate Professor in Ecology at the Department of Zoology, Stockholm University. And Peter Savolainen, Associate Professor in Evolutionary Genetics, KTH Royal Institute of Technology. Please give them a warm round of applause. Bodil, your research is on interactions between species, something called population dynamics and community ecology among large carnivores, which to people who aren't scientists would be big meat eaters. What are the main issues that you focus on?
Well, I basically want to try to find out why species have different abundances in different ecosystems and what are changing their abundances. And that is, of course, when we change the environment, but also when we take away or add species to the system. And I like to look at what happens when we change the existing species and the interactions between them. And it seems like this differs very much between different environments. And I like to find out why, and why does it matter in some cases and not in others.
So it's not as simple just to say that the most powerful animal will eat the weaker and then it all follows from there.
Well, it could, but then sometimes it sort of seems to have an effect that the most powerful species eat others, and that effect is spreading to other species that they are interacting with. And then in other cases, it doesn't seem to have as strong effects on the number and abundances of different species. And that's something I'm interested in finding out, why that is.
So it's a complex system then.
Yeah.
Jens, you're not a biologist, but a computer scientist working with biological issues. You've developed a method to look at how genes evolve over time. Could you tell us a little bit about what that approach can teach us?
Well, we actually have developed several such methods, and so have others. But I think it's fair to say that we've been at the forefront of a development where the focus has shifted from modeling single nucleotide substitutions, which is sort of the classical mutational event that people usually know about. A shift from that to modeling and considering more complex evolutionary events like gene duplications, where genes are duplicated. So all of a sudden you have two copies of a gene in a genome, such that one of them can keep the old function of the gene and the other one can mutate and pick up new functions.
So let's see if I can translate that in my mind. So a simple mutational event would be a gene changes its function and therefore
A simple mutational event would be a slight change of a gene that exists already, right? But a more complex event would be that you take an entire gene, you copy it, so you have two copies, and then one of the copies can keep the old function and the other one can mutate quite a lot and pick up a new function. So it's like, if you want to design a new object, you may take inspiration from an existing object and then modify it. That's something that happens quite a lot in evolution.
So is the focus on looking backwards through time, through the history of the genome? And can we also use this to look forwards in time of what we could hypothetically do with the genes?
Yes and no. In principle, yes, but in general, we are not so good at predicting the future. So I would say that it's best to keep the current focus on the past when you study evolution. But there's also many other complex evolutionary events that are interesting, like lateral gene transfer, where you transfer a gene from one species to another, or hybridizations where two species hybridize and sort of give rise to completely new species.
Very good. Peter, your research focuses on the origin and history of perhaps the most loved animal of all, the domestic dog. What do you find most interesting about the history of this species?
Well, I would say it's very many things that are interesting. So it's a whole complex of things that we are doing research on. First of all, it's the historical aspect. So we wonder who were these humans who tamed and domesticated the wolves and created the dogs. So it's a historical question of where and when did this happen. But it's also, for example, about behavior. How did the human behavior, how did the humans do technically, basically, to evolve, tame the wolf? How did they do that, and how did they evolve that into the dog? And how did the wolves react to being tamed by the humans? And what is the behavioral difference today between a wolf and a dog?
It does sound, I have to say, terrifying. The idea of trying to tame a wolf seems like a spectacularly dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. So
project.
that's kind of a riddle. How and why did they do it? Yeah. But we're also looking at the pure genetic evolution, I would say. So now we can look at all the genes in dogs and wolves, and we can compare them. So then we can try to find out what was the evolution of the wolf from the dog, which genes were changed. So basically, what we are trying to do, you could say that we are taking a wolf and we are looking at its genes, and then we wonder how should we change this wolf to make it a dog? Which genes should we fiddle with to do that? Yeah. So it's a bit like playing God in theory, making one species out of another.
What kind of a time scale are we talking about here? How long did it take for humans to achieve the astonishing variety of dogs that we see today?
Yeah, so relatively compared to what you are looking at, extremely fast. So the domestication and breeding of animals that we humans do, that's speeding up evolution thousands of times. So it's so much faster. So that's also another interesting aspect. We are looking at evolution, but at a very fast pace, I would say.
So let's see, between you, you're covering the ecosystems, the genetics, and the human interference in the process. So I feel like I'm in very safe hands with this rather complicated topic. I think we should clarify at least one term more before we continue, which is biodiversity. What is biodiversity? Is there good and bad biodiversity? Jens?
Well, I can talk a bit about the measures of biodiversity. If you want to hear about biodiversity, I think you should ask Bodil. So if you want to measure biodiversity that you can use, for instance, to, in some sense, predict the future, or how, in some sense, to evaluate an ecosystem, if it's functional, if it's at risk, etc., we're very far from that. The measures of biodiversity that actually take data into account are fairly crude, I would say. Then there are also biological models, narrative models that sort of talk about the components in an ecosystem and how they interact, etc. And there are some models that you can use for simulations. But we're very far away from models that can take, say, genomic data, some sort of metagenomic data for an environment, and based on that, say whether the ecosystem there is healthy or not.
Bodil, could you unravel that a bit? What would a healthy ecosystem be?
Well, the idea is that we would like to keep a variety of ecosystems and a variety of the species that are found within these ecosystems, and then also the genetic variation within the species that we see in the ecosystem. And the overall idea is that the biodiversity in that case, it's not just the nature types, the species, the genes, it's also the way they interact and function, how different species interact, the different limiting effects of some species of others, and all those processes that we would like to keep, or to sort of keep, or that we should keep to keep the ecosystem intact.
Is nature always right? Are natural ecosystems always healthy without human interference, or is that just an arbitrary decision? We say, well, if we have changed it, maybe we may have changed it for the worse.
Well, humans are also part of the ecosystem, so it's sort of in that sense, it's kind of a artificial distinction between natural and non-natural ecosystems. But then, of course, there are some ecosystems that are very strongly affected or created by people. So, and they would, of course, function very differently from the ones that we have less effect on. And the, I guess, problem in biodiversity conservation at the moment is that we are spreading our ecosystems so rapidly, so all the other diversity has very little space at the moment.
I don't think we should talk about natural or right, etc. I think we should look at the utility. Is there a need for the biodiversity? And then so if there's a need for the biodiversity, what kind of biodiversity, and then what do we do to keep it? That's, I think, are the main questions.
I take this to mean that there is a need for biodiversity. Then can we spell
I think
it
so.
out? Yeah.
So you were asking Peter about when the domestication started, and I think it's around 10,000 years or so. Something like that. And you know, what we eat, the plants and the animals, etc., that we eat, they're all domesticated more or less, right?
Yeah.
And this, as Peter mentioned, is a very short time scale. If you look at the general evolutionary time scale, where it was 5 million years since we split from chimp, etc. So we often see ourselves as sort of separated from the wildlife and nature. But that may just be an illusion, because we may still need plants. We may, it may be the case that we have had a lot of gene flow from wild plants into our domesticated plants quite recently, and we may want to domesticate more plants, etc. In that sense, we probably need a lot of biodiversity.
Peter?
I want to point out that one of the main problems now for the extinction of species is these all the domestic animals and plants that we have that has taken so much place in the world. So I mean, everything we grow and basically everything we eat, as Jens says, are domestic species, and they take so much space now. So that's one of the main problems.
Yeah, and also out of the wild species, some operate better around humans than others. I'm thinking of the red fox, which at one end of its habitat in Sweden, for instance, it's approaching the cities or in the cities, right? And at the other end, it's threatening the Arctic fox. Could you just mention that briefly?
Well, yes, I've been studying foxes a lot because they are sort of a species that can become very abundant in the ecosystem and then affect many other species. And I've studied the Arctic fox, which is declining and is threatened by extinction due to climate change. And I also studied the red fox, which interact with the red Arctic fox, spreading to the Arctic fox habitat and outcompeting the Arctic fox. And the red fox is a species that basically thrive in human-created environments. They have not many enemies unless humans hunt them, and there's lots of food and resources, so they are they are very favored by human presence in that sense.
So even when we are not, when we're not, for instance, hunting or destroying a habitat in a very immediate way, in different indirect ways, humanity is often still the culprit.
Yeah.
Can we say that all of this extinction that is happening now is caused by humans? All of these species that are disappearing, can we say, maybe scientists don't like categorical?
Not categorically all. There has always historically, millions of years back, been extinction of some species and new species have evolved. But the thing and the problem now is that the extinction is perhaps 1,000 times higher now, and that much higher rate of extinction that's caused by us humans. So, and that's why we have a problem now.
Would you say that we have a responsibility to save as many species as we can?
if nothing else, I mean, it's a practical thing. We can't know what do we know in do we need in future for from a practical point of view. For it might be good to have for food or for material or for medicines and so on. So it's a practical thing, but I think it's also a moral thing that, I mean, we are now living here on Earth in this biodiversity, and we have inherited that, and our children will inherit this from us. So perhaps it's not right if we just destroy everything here for all the future generations. So I don't think that. So we have it's a moral issue very much.
Do you guys agree? It's moral responsibility?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think because we are aware that we are having such a big impact, and we can also take responsibility to leave some of the diversity for future generations and for the sake of diversity in its own.
Jens, you look a little doubtful.
No, I'm pretty certain that we have a responsibility. This is a great resource. We should try to keep it. And we can ask ourselves, would we, for instance, have preferred to have a Baltic Sea that was alive today? I think most people would answer yes. And coming generations, we don't want to, give them the same kind of questions. We want to prevent that as much as possible.
Is it possible to turn this trend around, do you think? Could we halt this rate of extinction? Could we bring it to closer to well, again, with the danger of that word, but a natural level? Yes.
I don't think that's the right question. I think we should do as much as we can simply, and whether what pace it will have after we do take these measures, that's hard to say. But we should definitely make a very good try.
Now, we're going to bring in another panelist. Joining us via Skype, calling in, I think, from Switzerland, from Glant, is Mr. Marco Lambertini, Director General of the World Wildlife Fund International. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. Mr. Lambertini, one of your organization's main goals is to preserve biodiversity, and we've just started covering this topic. How would you describe the situation in the world right now?
Well, some of the panelists already mentioned this. The situation is pretty bad, I have to say, and quite disturbing. If you look at the IUCN Red List, the species threatened with extinction, we are talking about 1 every 2 amphibians, frogs, newts, and salamanders being threatened with extinction. 1 in 4 mammals and 1 in 8 birds. And our Living Planet report you mentioned at the beginning shows actually even at the population level, individuals level, we have lost a lot. And the recent collection of information from a lot of population around the world is talking about 50% decline of wildlife populations over the last 40 years. That means we have halved the population of wild animals on the planet in only 40 years. And this is due mainly to habitat loss and degradation, and unfortunately also unsustainable exploitation, hunting and fishing. And this is a very, very serious situation.
Now, do you agree? Why do you agree? Why does your organization think that maintaining biodiversity is important? Is it a utilitarian perspective or a moral perspective primarily?
It's a mixed bag of perspective, of course. And first of all, I would be bolder than the previous speakers in saying that it's not important, it's essential. First of all, there is, and I agree, a strong moral imperative. I think we are sharing the planet with many other species, and we have the duty to respect their existence. And there are spiritual and cultural reasons about that. Recently, as mentioned, the value of biodiversity and natural ecosystems to our economy has been actually very clearly demonstrated. There was a very important report called The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity that actually quantifies, and it's not an easy calculation, but quantifies the tangible benefits in something between 3 to 6 trillion US dollars per year. And that includes the role of forests to produce clean air and water, the role of insects in pollination, coastal reefs and mangroves forest in mitigating impact of natural disasters, And things which are more subtle, like from a pharmacological breakthrough coming out of biodiversity and the increasing role of forests and oceans to actually mitigate and stabilize our climate vis-a-vis climate change. And finally, the last point is that there is also a fascinating research which actually started years ago with a beautiful book of Edward O. Wilson in the States about, it was called biophilia hypothesis. Makes a point that we need nature. We have been evolving in nature, close contact with nature, and we need nature. We feel happy when we are in contact with nature. And the wildlife plays a major role. That's why kids are fascinated by animals. And that's why WWF sell a lot of peluche around the world.
I think Bodil mentioned before the Arctic fox as one example of many animals that are affected directly by climate change. Do you think that these levels of extinction, how much of that is climate change related, or how much is the urgency connected to that issue? Because there's of course also a communications problem that right now the climate issue is the most urgent to solve. So all of the other environmental crises that are also occurring are overshadowed by this.
Absolutely, it's a great question. First of all, I have to say that the direct impact of climate change is not yet as acute as it will be in a few decades. So climate change is projected to be the most important factor for ecosystem alteration and potentially species extinction over time, and is beginning to have an impact across many, many populations of many, many species and many, many habitats. But right now, in the immediate term, really habitat loss, particularly conversions of forest and other natural habitat into agricultural and farmland or grazing areas are really the main driver of species extinction and wildlife population decline. But also, as I said before, of loss of ecosystem services, the services that forests, rivers, lakes, and oceans give us every day without us knowing it, realizing it, and acknowledging it. But luckily, we are beginning to actually realize that more and more, and that's a major step forward in enabling us to react, to take action.
So one of the things we do at Crosstalks is we try to think a little bit further than we normally would. So Jens, I may have to point you towards that future anyway. From your point of view, could we recreate a species that has gone extinct? I think many of us have seen films like Jurassic Park, so we can imagine it, but is that realistic?
I was actually thinking about this a couple of weeks ago. I read this article in the newspaper about resurrecting the passenger pigeon. And I guess that this is sort of based on a scenario where you would sequence an extinct species. You would then synthesize its genome and put it in some cell. And I think there's many problems with this. First of all, when we sequence a species or a genome, we actually only sequence very small pieces, and then they are sort of assembled together in a puzzle. And depending on the method you use for assembling the genome, you get a different genome. So we actually don't know today how to get an exact genome for a species. That may be an obstacle that may be removed in the future. But then there are additional problems. So when you insert it in a cell, if you look at the start of a human life, there's actually lots of other components in the cell except from the genome. There's transcriptional regulations, there's methylation, etc., that turn off and on genes. And we don't have those even if we sequence the genome. Then, of course, you can ask many other questions, like, in the general public, there's a concern for genetically modified food. And here you would create something that you don't have control over at all. I would say, much more dangerous than a genetically modified food. But most of all, if you create, say, recreate or resurrect the passenger pigeon, you will also resurrect its viruses. And I don't think that would not be popular today. We already have a couple of viruses that people are very concerned with.
So there's also, yes, I see, there's a huge problem there. I'm also thinking about genetic variation. If we have one, because people are talking about resurrecting a woolly mammoth, that's something that people are working on in the world. Even if you have one, that doesn't actually mean you have a species. You do need a fair amount of them with some genetic diversity to be able to maintain a population as well. So it seems, Peter.
I would say that's a question for Bodil.
Well,
yeah, what do we need? We need more than one individual, obviously. We need
obviously,
a number of individuals.
Yeah. And we also need the habitat for them.
Exactly.
And for some species that may be available. But on the other hand, the ecosystem have changed a lot since, in many cases, these species went extinct. So we don't really know what would happen if we re-release them. How would they interact with other species? And could they potentially then drive other species to extinction or cause some kind of other shifts sort of in the way the ecosystem function?
There's something called a cascade effect. Is this a cascade effect you're describing?
It could be that we have the direct effect of one species being put back into an ecosystem or removed from it on the species that it directly interacts with, which it feeds on or is fed upon by. But then it's also the cascading effects, the indirect effects of the species that in turn affect and so on. So these things are very difficult to predict. So there could be risks associated with it as well.
Yeah, we have some really bad examples of planting animals into and plants into sort of a new environment, like the introduction of rabbits into Australia 100 years ago. They wanted a few rabbits there to hunt, and so they planted in 100 or so, and now there are millions of them, hundreds of millions of rabbits. And it's a real ecological disaster and also economical disaster. It costs tens or hundreds of millions each year, the destruction that these rabbits do in Australia.
Well, are there any theoretical situations that you could imagine where it would be a good idea to recreate and reinstate a species into an ecosystem?
No.
I could imagine if it's something that has gone extinct very recently, where we sort of think we still have the habitat and a potential, we see sort of a need for that species to be resurrected and retaking the fulfillment of the role that it had in that ecosystem. But I still think it's very hypothetical, and it would be probably much cheaper to save the species before it goes extinct than to try to recreate it afterwards.
That's the obvious focus.
Yes, Marco agrees. Yeah, I do see it. It is a very impractical strategy. Of course, it also sounds, astronomically expensive to even attempt to bring back a species.
And I think that the main reason to do this, it's not to save a species. It's just that these scientists who wants to do it, they want to do cool science. So I think that's the whole thing.
So, okay, but how the ethics of cool science then? Yeah. We feel that's a little bit wobbly. That's maybe not a good enough reason to do it. Okay, I'm just thinking aloud now, but here's a suggestion for cool science. If you take a species that's approaching extinction, I'm realizing this might be super inappropriate, I'm sorry, but could we breed qualities into animals that are about to go extinct that would make them better suited for their current habitats? Could we take some of our experience with dogs, for instance, to try and save the Arctic fox, for instance?
We could, in theory, I think, but on the other hand, we risk creating something that we didn't think about. So we could create a super efficient Arctic fox, which spreads across to other ecosystems and start to eradicate other species by preying on them. That has happened on sort of islands where Arctic foxes has been reintroduced, or introduced actually, where they never were present, where they have basically had very negative effects on bird biodiversity. So again, we could maybe, but it's very difficult to say whether it would actually have the effect that we are looking for. So again, it would probably be easier to try to, and more cost efficient and safe to try to just keep the diversity that we have and know.
Yes.
The evolution is doing the selection for us. We don't have to try to attempt it. And I actually believe that evolution is doing it much better than we do.
Still, I'm starting to realize very well that the science fiction science isn't perhaps going to solve this problem. So we need to go back then to the original challenge of the current situation with biodiversity and think about how we approach that. I think perhaps, Marco Lambertini, do you think, is this a knowledge problem? Is there some kind of additional knowledge that science could find out that would make us better at countering this threat, or is this entirely a cultural challenge?
I'm sure there is a knowledge dimension as well, but let me just say very plainly that I think it may be an interesting and exciting exercise to resuscitate the woolly mammoth, but for a theme park maybe, not clearly to play a role in the natural ecosystem, particularly at the time when every year 20,000 elephants out of a population of 500,000 in Africa are poached. And I think this is where we need to put our resources. It is not just about knowledge, it's actually about a reaction that goes through people, willingness to really make a difference, to consume wisely, companies to produce wisely, and political commitment to really make this thing happen and square the circle between civil society, governments, and private business. This is happening already and is very encouraging, for example, on a number of certification schemes like the Forest Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council, schemes that ensure consumers around the world that buying that kind of fish, buying that kind of timber, we can actually be quite sure that actually the forests are logged in a sustainable way, fish are caught, but without bycatch, without destroying the marine habitat. So this is where we need to put our attention and focus in learning how to live sustainably within the boundaries of the planet. Right now, we are not. We are consuming more resources than the planet can offer. We are cutting trees faster than they can reproduce, they can regrow, fishing fish faster than they can reproduce, and pump CO2 in the atmosphere faster than the natural system can absorb. This is where we should focus on. And it's not just because it's nice, it's because we must do that. Because if not, there will be no just and prosperous future for humanity in a degraded environment.
Now you said a just future, because I think poaching of elephants, for instance, is that one of those examples where we always imagine that practice is at least in part driven by poverty and desperation, that for the individuals who do poaching, who hunt these animals that you aren't allowed to hunt, that this is driven by some kind of human need, poverty being the most obvious cause. But really, systemically speaking, it's not poor people who are the big problem, it's rich people, like most of the global north. Would I be correct in this assumption?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it is the global everything everywhere now, because there are rich constituencies in almost every country. But talking about poaching is very interesting, because now we are dealing actually with a truly criminally organized, internationally organized crime. So there are really international gangs organizing a massive traffic of wildlife, which is now ranking 4th in the overall illegal trade after arms, drugs, and human trafficking. So it's a massive problem. The local communities are actually affected rather than enhanced by the poaching. They may be involved and may be getting some short-term money, but actually the best examples that we have of empowerment of communities, for example, where we work in Namibia or in Zimbabwe or in South Africa, is where areas are actually managed by communities. They have access to the resources of their land, including wildlife, in a sustainable way. And this is a really long-term revenue, including ecotourism and other activities on those areas. And in those areas, poaching is almost zero, because the communities are the best stewards of those areas and the wildlife in it.
Very well. What would the three of you say then, though? What is the role of science in this massive cultural change? With the kind of work you do, what can you do to change this culture? What are you doing?
So the role of science is critical, has always been and will continue to be in many different strands, both in terms of developing a good monitoring system to really let us understand and know what the real situation is. We are a science-based organization. We make use of good science, and we want to be evidence-based. This is the only way we can convince politicians and the public of taking action. So there is no doubt science has a great role to play, also in terms of innovation and funding technological solution to some of the problems we are facing in the environment. But as I said, we really also need to work on us as individuals. We are 7 billion, we are going to be 10 billion in the next 30, 40 years. We have to really learn how to consume wisely and produce responsibly. It is possible. It is possible. And we know and we understand that also we do need to maintain a good balance between productive ecosystem like farming and grazing areas and fishing grounds and intact natural ecosystem that can actually support the productivity of these areas.
Thank you.
There are plenty of examples.
Bodil, Elmhagen, so what would you say? What is the role of science?
Well, I would agree. I mean, what we do is, of course, to try to find out what's going on, and that also means that we are trying to find out what can be done about it. And then, of course, we also have the responsibility to try to communicate that to other people so that we don't just sit and do our thing and then no one knows what we found out. But, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
Yes, there's a lot to be done in terms of understanding ecosystem, modeling sort of the genomic diversity in the system, measuring it, and also comparing to how it has been during evolution. And that work is going on, but hopefully it will get an increased focus.
One does suspect that the utility that you were talking about at the beginning, that is actually key, because somehow it seems easier to motivate legislation, for instance, if you can show a practical need for, or even a potential practical utility for instance, specific biotopes or something like that.
Yes, but the problem is that quite often grant agencies and similar instances, they want a very immediate application. So they want to see a product within a couple of years rather than an argument that biodiversity is important and that we can take advantage of it later on.
Couldn't you have a movement for scientists? Couldn't you all work together with the totality of your knowledge of ecosystems and stand up on the barricades and say that this is worth protecting, and just give us some time and we will tell you why eventually?
But that's not our role.
No?
We're supposed to be pretty objective, right? We're supposed to look at the situation without having an opinion in advance.
Okay, I'll throw another one at you and we'll see. Could you think of a scenario where it would be desirable, or at least morally acceptable as a compromise, to eradicate a species? For instance, the malaria mosquito, or the fruit bat that spreads the Ebola virus. It's
yes,
not a trick question.
No.
Peter.
I mean, absolutely. If human lives are at stake, obviously, it's right to do a lot of things to save lives, like millions of Africans dying from malaria. So in a way, yes, it's morally right, I would say. But again, we are back to that question: what if we take away this mosquito totally from Africa? What comes instead? What will happen? So it will always be this insecurity about the consequences, even if you are out to do something good. So it's a tricky thing to do.
I think we have a question from Skype, a caller. Do we? Let's see. This is always very exciting. Hello? Hello. Please state your name and your question, please. Hello? Anne-Marie,
Hello?
can you hear us? Hi.
Hey.
Please state your question.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie. I'm a master's student at KTH, and I'm calling from Stockholm here. My question is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, as stewards of our 21st century society, I believe, and as Marco said, we have a moral imperative to preserve and protect species. What strategies can be developed to ensure constructive dialogue and buy-in from politicians, regulators, government officials, and most importantly, to win the hearts and minds of everyday people?
Very good. Thank you, Anne-Marie. That's a big question right there, but that's why we have some very, very smart people on the panel. What strategies can we use to get people to actually work together? Jens, you look like you have a theory.
No,
No?
I think this is a bit outside my field of expertise.
I must say, I mean, it's a main problem that this question is, there is so little knowledge about it. So information is a big problem, I think. But perhaps it's very much up to Marco, I think.
Very good. Marco,
this.
what do you think? What are the best strategies?
I think there is no silver bullet, and of course we are dealing with different stage of development, different differences in culture around the world. So there are different values that we just mentioned before that play a stronger role in exciting people and triggering action. So in some places is appreciation and love for nature. In other places is more utilitarian, and it varies from individual and individual too. So it's a composite strategy. But I think the most important thing is that we do actually present the evidence, and I think now the world, I feel really after 30 years in conservation, I have to say, I actually feel quite positive. Despite the decline of wildlife, despite the problems we're facing, I feel positive because I think the world, and I mean the whole world, not just the West and the North, has never been more aware of the problems and the solutions. And I think we're beginning to react to a problem which is so visible. You know, we're talking about evolution. We have scientists here dealing with genetic evolution and all the rest. We have been evolved. We've been evolving as a reactive species, and we need to feel before actually we react. And I feel that actually now we are beginning to react. And some of the example I made before, all the debate about climate change, everything which is going to happen in the next few years, and we have a lot of innovation, technological innovation as well to deal with these problems. Many more people are being sensitized and are beginning to react. And so we need to continue to push on making people aware of the problem, of the solutions at individual level, political level, and business level. And I think these three dimensions are really now coming together, and this is where we need to work on.
Thank you. But what I'm hearing in a way is that the complexity of the solution, that science does actually have a role, that there is still so much we could do about understanding, for instance, how ecosystems function or how genes develop. We need to know more to be able to explain it as though to a child, to the general public, to our lawmakers and so on, to make that narrative clearer. In a way, it's very difficult to stand up and say, well, we don't actually know specifically. It would be very useful to know more. So there is over here, there's a solution which is a clear and comprehensible story, and here is the scientific process that hasn't quite reached the point where we could formulate those answers that the general public needs somehow. I don't know. That's not even a question. I'm trying to understand it myself. Anna-Marie, are you satisfied with this answer?
No, I think that's very good. I think Marco is definitely on the right track, and I think education and awareness of the people is a key issue. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, I would like to let the room ask some questions now. I'm giving you this little check to see whether anybody has anything immediately on their mind. Not yet. Very good. Then I can ask you all one additional question while they're thinking. In your respective fields, if we're thinking about this project of moving towards more knowledge, right now, what makes you personally the most excited about going to work? It doesn't have to be your specific project necessarily, but what's the breakthrough that everybody is waiting for in your field? Or is there something that's quite just within reach which will be exciting? Peter.
Yeah, in my field, it's still the question of exactly where did the dogs evolve from wolf, which place in the world? And the following question is, who were the humans who did this? So this is still a living question.
Mm-hmm. Are we approaching an answer to that one?
Yes, I'm pretty certain we will know quite a lot in 5 or 10 years at least.
Mm-hmm. That's a very short time span. That's very exciting. Bodil, what about you?
Well, I think within my field, what has been said is that a basic problem when we try to study the cascading effects of, for example, large carnivores is that they have already been eradicated from so many large parts of the world, so that it's difficult to study because it already has happened. Yeah. And the examples that we have are relatively few and based on recent reintroductions and in some cases still existing species. So I would basically return to what I said initially to sort of find more information on what actually happens when we start meddling with big consumers. It's not just large carnivores, but also large herbivores, which are like elephants and stuff. What happens when we are meddling with these species, and potentially also, why do we see different things when we meddle with them in different ecosystems?
Yeah, very exciting. And what about Jens?
Well, I think we have very good chances to map out the evolution, or especially in the part of life where there's a tree of life, to find that tree and also reconstruct genomes and the evolutionary history of genes and other functional elements of our genomes. And I think that will be very relevant for what we're discussing today. So you know, when you can start to map sequences to this tree of life and see where in a certain which species you can find in a certain ecosystem, and measure how, you know, these decrease, I guess, most often, but possibly also increase, how it shifts over time.
Your tree of life, that's incredibly suggestive. It's like a family tree, so to speak, of how everything is related.
The tree of life is the evolutionary tree describing the evolution of species. It doesn't exist everywhere. You know, among bacteria, you have more complicated events that sort of isn't tree-like, but it's a very useful tool in most fields of biology.
I think you have just answered the question that I couldn't formulate before, because there is a narrative device that might actually be able to help us to communicate why we're all related, why it matters that we are an animal too, so to speak. Now let's have a question from the room. Yes, please. State your name and your question, please.
My name is Fredrik Westerberg, and is it a sound here?
Yes.
I'm from Amoristerna, and we talk a lot about politics and psychology and moral. To the chairwoman here is my question. You mentioned that you asked the panel if they saw it in an altruistic way or in a moral way. I mean that those two questions may be the same, because some persons have a very altruistic view on things and others have less of that. So do you mean something special with that, or you do not need to answer, but I was a little confused what you meant.
To me, I don't know. I don't remember exactly what I said now. I think what I meant wasn't necessarily altruistic. I think it's a moral responsibility, or moral utilitarian responsibility then, I think, that we may have a responsibility either to save these species for their own sake, or to save them for a potential utility later.
Utilitarian, you mean? Okay.
In that
yes.
case, yes.
I put the question wrong. Yes, you used the word utilitarian. Yes. Okay, but I think that they are the same in a way. But yes, okay.
They might be. Thank you very much. Now, do you have a reflection on this? Do you agree? Disagree? No. No. Do we have another question from the room? We don't. In that case, I would like to ask one final question of Marco Lambertini. You said that you are hopeful. Could you give us some advice if we want to be on Team Hope, if we want to be a part of the solution rather than part of the problem, individually? And remember that most of our audience are graduate students who can actually go out and choose paths in the world of science as well. What should we do next?
I think anything that goes in the direction of developing a society which is able to live within the boundaries of our natural resources in the one planet we have. So it could be economics, it could be financial investment, it could be biology, anything, because it's now, conservation and environmental preservation is now a totally multidisciplinary topic. In WWF, we employ increasingly more economists than biologists, because really we have to deal with the drivers, and the drivers are consumption, are investment, are even governance. So we're beginning to go into good governance discussions, because this is absolutely critical to manage sustainably natural resources. So my advice is actually, whatever discipline you do, keep sustainability and the environment at the heart, because this is going to be the future. The future need for this civilization is to really develop a future which is in balance.
Very
and
good.
We need all disciplines coming together.
Thank you very much, Marco. Well, I think the message is, if we manage to solve this one, we will be perhaps an even greater generation than the one that domesticated the wolf, because this is an even harder challenge. So great to speak to you, Jens Lagergren, Bodil Elmhagen, Peter Savolainen, and Marco Lambertini. I'd love to continue on this topic. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Do stay put for our next episode, which begins on the hour. We will talk about the Ebola outbreak and the threat of global pandemics. See you then.